Welcome back to another episode of The State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hamid, CEO of Altruistic. In this episode, we're going to talk about CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and we're going to try and cover ground that hasn't already been covered by the many other people talking about CBAM from a purely legislative or data gathering perspective. We're going to talk a little more big picture, a little more kind of global strategy, national strategy. It's going to be fun. We're not going to talk too much about just all the intricacies of the legislation itself and, how to do your CBAM reporting and all that fun stuff, because I assume most listeners to this podcast are already sort of conversant with that. I want to instead talk about how CBAM rollout is going and also what I think the implications of CBAM are for trade, for business, and where I see all this settling. And so this is kind of just a CBAM big picture in some ways. So to start with, as of the beginning of this year, the definitive phase of CBAM implementation began. First certificate prices for CBAM have been published. As a quick refresher, the way that this works with CBAM is that there are certain industries that are the focus of CBAM, specifically steel, fertilizers, cement, aluminum, and hydrogen and electricity, although those are handled a little differently. And the way that then CBAM works is it is intended to prevent offshoring of emissions outside of Europe. So what it wants to avoid is that because you end up having to pay a high tariff or a high carbon tax through your ETS scheme, your cap and trade scheme within Europe, you therefore offshore your emissions to China, India, or another geography by sort of outsourcing the production of the manufacturing. And therefore, Europe ends up losing the local revenue contribution, the local job creation, and also doesn't end up actually reducing its overall emissions from a scope 3 perspective because the emissions just move outside as well as the jobs and the production. So that's the reason that CBAM kind of set about to add those controls in place. And the way that it works is then if you're in one of these sectors and you're exporting into Europe, as part of CBAM, you have to kind of work out how much you're exporting to Europe, what is the carbon tax or equivalent that you paid in the geography where you produced this thing that is being exported into Europe, and what is the difference between that and what you would have paid in Europe. And then that difference, you basically have to buy in the form of certificates or pay in the form of certificates. And so the certificate prices that have been published in January, I think it's about 75 euros per TCO2e, per ton of CO2 equivalent, is now live. And that's the price that will run going forward for the current phase. I think there's a bunch of stuff that is going to be really interesting in this. One is we talked a little bit about the sectors of focus. I think as you look at the emphasis across those sectors, you find that steel is about 69% of volume covered. Fertilizer is about 15%. Cement is about 11%. Aluminum is about 5%. And then across most of the materials that are in scope, particularly across steel, you're looking at China and Russia as two of the largest likely exporters into Europe for those two materials. And so I think there's almost an angle where you could say this is kind of also a bit of a proxy tax on Russia and China. I don't think that's how it was intended, but that's sort of how it's going to be received. And that is sort of how it's being received. The counter to CBAM, and this is now a little bit of CBAM history, which is just a couple of years old, the sort of challenge was that this is effectively anti-competitive behavior by the European Union. This is setting up trade barriers, and this is actually kind of this is sort of depriving emerging markets of an advantage that European countries had for many years, where European countries for many years were able to sort of produce unchecked and build up capacity and scale, and now they're sort of depriving emerging markets of the same opportunities. The actual sums involved are not really large. And so the estimates that I've seen is that this is going to generate a couple of billion euros of revenue for the European Union from CBAM. So it's actually not huge amounts of money that we're talking about. I think the sting is going to be felt in a few ways. One is that even though it's just a few billion euros, because these industries are commodity industries. Again, think of steel, right, and fertilizer and cement. These are not high margin sectors. Even a couple of percentage points of additional cost in the form of what is really a tax can actually quite meaningfully harm the competitiveness of certain producers and certain geographies. So even though the magnitude is not very big, the sting can be felt quite disproportionately. Second is that I think that it has been perceived particularly negatively by a number of the countries that depend very highly on these specific materials. And so I'm actually not so much thinking of China or Russia. I'm also thinking of Qatar, for instance, where for Qatar, natural gas is a massive product, a massive export of theirs. And one of the big derivatives that you get from natural gas is fertilizer, ammonium-based fertilizer. And so actually one of the strongest or most vociferous backlashes that I saw last year or over the last couple of years to CBAM was from Qatar. To the point where they were kind of just almost threatening to divert their trade flows to other countries. So this is a bit of like the background context of CBAM and how it's got going. Now, as most other countries started to realize that CBAM is going ahead and the politics of it is not going to put a spanner in the works, not going to really impede the development of CBAM, a couple of interesting things started happening. One is that you start to get some conversation around these climate clubs or climate cartels, where actually you might have parallel CBAMs. The US started saying, well, could we have a US CBAM actually as well? Japan started talking about maybe a Japanese-led equivalent to CBAM. And so just these other groups, because what you want to avoid is that you give Europe a disproportionate advantage in trade. And the expert assessment is that the introduction of CBAM does actually act as an advantage for Europe versus Europe's trade allies. And so the idea would be, could you actually even this out? Because if Europe is going to charge a tax, let's say on American exports to Europe, a carbon tax, shouldn't the US also be charging a carbon tax on European exports into America so they capture some of the revenue? I think that is a hard one to get moving. And as you can see in the US, there's going to be a lot of political back and forth probably before this really gathers momentum. And it might take a couple of different administrations to really push it through. What I think is more interesting is where you start to see a reaction in the form of emissions trading schemes and the development of emissions trading schemes in these countries. And so one of the most interesting examples I can see is how China is now starting to really develop a focus on its own national emissions trading scheme to say, well, how do we actually develop the carbon pricing mechanism and carbon costing mechanism that we're using internally within China and apply that to different sectors? And the reason becomes, do we really want to have Europe capture the tax revenue, the carbon tax revenue of all these certificates that our exporters are going to be having to buy? If the way that you calculate how much they're going to have to spend in certificates is you take what would they pay if they were based in Europe and what do they pay if they're based in China, and you take the difference and you pay Europe that difference effectively in certificates. Wouldn't we rather just charge that on the Chinese side by raising our carbon price, raising our carbon tax, and actually capturing that revenue in China? By the way, I'm using carbon tax and carbon price interchangeably here because they kind of are interchangeable in this context. So what China is now looking at is, can we take the sectors that are going to be hardest hit by CBAM and can we gradually phase in our own robust ETS system sector by sector across those areas? Now, there's an interesting challenge here as well, which is when you do that, it makes a lot of sense because it captures the tax revenue on the Chinese side. At the same time, you apply it to all your producers because you have to, not just those exporting into Europe. So that actually, it becomes just super fascinating because it sort of raises the climate playing field across the whole sector in China. And if you say, well, China is a very large chunk of steel exports to Europe, but it is also a very large chunk of steel exports to the rest of the world. And if China is going to have to try and gradually carbon tax its own steel sector, does that just basically start to drive decarbonization across global steel in a really big way? I think that gets to be super interesting because the way that these ETS schemes work, the logic is that whatever tax revenue you gather, you start to recycle back into decarbonization efforts. So you get a virtuous cycle. You get companies funding the decarbonization of the sector, which means over time, the sector has to pay less tax. That's why it makes sense. So let's just sort of, bear with me while I kind of just follow this thread down to the end of the rabbit hole. By the way, I think this rabbit hole is a reference to Alice in Wonderland in this context, which I've been rereading on my Kindle, because otherwise the reference just wouldn't make sense. Like who goes down a rabbit hole, actually? Anyway, sorry, random aside. My point being, if you follow this rabbit hole down to the end, then you start to say, well, China has developed this really interesting pattern over the last 20 years particularly, where they say, let us take one linchpin sector industry. Let us find within that industry a technology that is going to be really important for what happens over the next 30 years. And let us basically just carpet bomb that technology with money, such that a million flowers bloom, and they bloom in China when it comes to that technology. They will all eviscerate each other competitively, and only one or two of them may survive, or three of them may survive. But those three juggernauts will be just massive global phenomena. And you can see them having done this really effectively with electric vehicles, for instance. You now look at BYD. You see them doing not just within electric vehicles, but you see battery technology. You see solar panels, actually. There was a time when solar panels were still a competitive space. If you go back 20 years, we were talking about thin film technology. We were talking about conventional solar panels. We were talking about lots of different producing locations. And now basically it is all just China. You then say, okay, well, great. What are the alternative technologies that you could have if there's another strand that plays out here? And maybe you get hydrogen. And then you have China saying, well, electrolyzers are the linchpin for hydrogen technology. Let's just again, carpet bomb the electrolyzer space with money and see what we get. And so you sort of have these linchpin technology domination tactics that China has perfected over the last 20 years. And I think that actually would make sense for China to say, well, let's push steel in that direction too. Let's make sure that the greenest steel in the world is Chinese steel, because most steel in the world will be Chinese steel. And if the greenest steel in the world has to be Chinese steel, what is the technology that decarbonizes steel? Let's take that and let's make that Chinese too, so that if you want to compete with us on the basis of green steel in India or Russia, or wherever, you kind of have to import our technology to do it. I think that's sort of the Chinese end game on decarbonization. Although knowing China, I don't think that this is the end game. I think it's probably just the mid game 50 years from now. And I think that CBAM is going to actually inadvertently act as a bit of an accelerator. What's interesting is this happens at the same time that European efforts to meaningfully decarbonize steel are actually sort of falling behind. If you look at H2 green steel, that was going to be one of the big success stories. And then last I checked, it's sort of some way collapsing into insolvency. Same thing with battery technology. Northvolt, the massive European challenger in the battery tech scene, again, sort of collapsing into insolvency, or already collapsed. I think it's a bit complicated. They have different entities, but the main entity is it has sort of freewheeled into collapse. And you just sort of say, well, Europe has led the charge on regulating these sectors, on creating the incentives for disruptors and innovators to play in these sectors, but then has somehow dropped the ball on actually building the industrial juggernauts that you need to capture advantage in these sectors. And time again, what you're finding is that the country that captures that is China. You get this massive push towards clean energy 20 years ago, sponsored by Europe, and the player that captures it is China. You get this massive investment in understanding the implications of hydrogen technology. 10 years ago, companies like Shell and to an extent BP, but mostly Shell, were the ones like saying, hey, this could be a real thing. Europe was coming up with white papers on hydrogen technology, and China just quietly went and dominated the electrolyzer space. And I think that this is starting to be a really interesting theme that CBAM is going to accelerate. So let's just bring us back a little on the big picture strategy side, and then I want to talk a bit about practical implications and so on. On the big picture side, I think we're starting to see CBAM come out. We saw some pushback on the political stage. A lot of that pushback has, I think, now reconciled itself to the fact that CBAM is happening, like it or not. And you therefore move into this zone where countries are now starting to think about, well, what do they do to optimize within CBAM? I think that from an implementation standpoint, we now have a couple of different challenges to think through. One is, okay, great, now the legislation is out there. Who's going to be managing all of the data, all of the verification, assurance, Like just all of that massive trail of information that is necessary for this to actually be effective. This podcast is brought to you by Altruistic. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistic's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistic.com to find out more. That's altruistic with a Q. And as with most of this stuff, it seems that Europe didn't really think that bit through in great detail. And so the idea was, well, this is going to be generally a cottage industry of, a sort of mushrooming space of vendors and solution providers and so on. And I think that a lot of that is coming into play. So in the software space, for example, players that focus on serving the automotive sector and sectors where there's a big CBAM component or dependence are starting to think about or are already implementing CBAM dashboards and analytics and data. But really, this is still just the front end. You have a massive supply chain traceability piece to sort through, which is still being done. Verification is kind of a bit of an open area requiring more innovation and more work. And so I think that there's a lot of kinks to play out. And what we're likely going to find is that this first year ends up being very much a trial year. The analogy I use is like a first pancake year, where when you're making pancakes, the first pancake is usually too buttery and not quite right. And so you throw it away and you proceed with making pancakes. And I think that's going to be this first year for CBAM implementation. I think the second set of kinks to work through is, well, what does the money really get used for in terms of the decarbonization alternatives? And we sort of started with steel. And if you look at steel, I believe that the CBAM impact is going to be about 100 to 130 euros per ton at full phase out of CBAM by 2034. That's going to be the additional premium that you pay basically as a steel producer. But the current green steel premium is about 200 to 300 euros per ton. And so actually, CBAM still doesn't make regular steel competitive versus green steel. Or rather, despite adding a bunch of taxation, CBAM doesn't level the playing field between the polluted version versus the clean version, or the dirty version versus the clean version. Which begs the question, does it achieve the purpose that it's intended to achieve, actually, if it doesn't actually bring parity with the clean version versus the dirty version? So having thought a bit about the macro strategy, let's now go into some of the implementation points. I think there's a couple in particular worth calling out. And then we should cover a little bit of a footnote on electricity and hydrogen as well, because those are sort of treated differently. So on the implementation front, one piece is going to be around data verification and audit. And I think that this, like most things that Europe has done in this space, this was thought through in a lot of detail from a legal standpoint, but in very little detail from a practical who does this standpoint. And so the assumption with, for example, CSRD was just, well, surely the big four and established services firms and a whole coterie of smaller SME players in this will get into this and figure this out and solve this problem. And by and large, that's what's happened. I would say it's taken several years, a lot of capital, and a fair bit of chaos for that to happen. And that's probably what is going to happen with CBAM, data trail verification audit, etc. as well. The assumption is that every kind of stakeholder along the trade chain sort of manages their own bit and verifies what's before them, or what's earlier in the chain. And then there's a requirement for third-party assurance across the whole process, which means that someone has to either digitally or physically audit the actual factories making the actual stuff. I think this is going to get quite complicated, and that's probably one of the reasons why the period for full phase out is so long. It's 2034 before all of this stuff gets fully phased out. The revenue expectation, like I said, is a few billion euros in the very near term. And the idea is that this scales up and becomes 10, 12, 13, 14,000 euros by full phase out by 2034 or so. But I think that requires this whole little ecosystem to work well or smoothly. So I think that's kind of one of the kinks that needs to be really worked out. I think the other kink is going to be around how does this actually work towards decarbonization? Because the ethos of this was that it levels the playing field in Europe and outside Europe for anyone wanting to sell stuff in Europe. So producers inside Europe and outside Europe are kind of on the same playing field. But at the same time, the goal must be that everyone decarbonizes over time. And so the revenues from this sort of a tax need to go to fund innovation and need to make sure that competitively innovators are on the same footing as those who don't innovate. And I think that oddly enough, this tax doesn't really go as far as it needs to in that vein or in that direction. If you look at, for example, the impact on steel, the current estimate that we have for what CBAM adds to regular steel in terms of cost is about 100 to 130 euros per ton at full phase out by 2034. And if you look at the green steel premium, it's about 200 to 300 euros per ton. So actually CBAM closes about half that gap, but not more than that, really. You could say half is quite a lot, but you could also say it's nowhere near enough, and no one would buy green steel, or very few people would buy green steel unless they had to at that kind of a price difference, which is exactly the reason why H2 green steel, I guess, didn't manage to get off the ground. I think you could make a better argument for saying, do you start to get innovation around the edges? And so around the edges would be, okay, fine, we're not doing hydrogen-based steel production, but we're using electric arc furnaces, for instance. And an electric arc furnace can reduce the requirement for natural gas, I believe, by like 50% or 60% and shift that towards electricity, which could be renewable electricity. And that can be a really nice, really big win. I don't think you would call that green steel. I think you would call that blue steel, I think is the term. I think blue is something that's greenish in this context, but there's probably like a technical nuance I'm missing there or I've forgotten. But anyway, you get the energy efficiency gain from that sort of innovation. You might get more recycled content being used. So you could actually get, with this or with CBAM, you could actually get a lot of iterative innovation. I don't think you'll get necessarily a big build out of a new technology. And that, again, is the piece that I think Europe has not really managed to achieve well. And I don't think this CBAM will do that either. I think what's interesting in this sort of manufacturing is that a lot of the innovation might well come from middle economies, I would say, or emerging markets. I don't know what the politically correct term is now. I feel like coming from Pakistan, I can use any term I want because I'm from there, but there's probably a better term. In the way that I think actually Turkish steel is now going after developing electric arc furnace technology in a robust way. Whereas actually, I think Europe was ahead on this from what I remember. I think that, I know in the glass industry, for instance, the first electric arc furnace was being used in Europe and is now actually being replicated in other geographies. And so in steel as well, I imagine that a lot of the innovations started a little earlier on in Europe and has now gone elsewhere to scale. So those are my thoughts on CBAM. Just to do a quick summary, rollout is now happening. A lot of the political debate has sort of settled for a bit, for better or worse. I would say if you're sort of pro climate change mitigation, then the better side of that is that Omnibus has kind of had its impact. It's taken some types of companies out of scope, but broadly speaking, CBAM is now going ahead and is in implementation. On the worst side, I think you could say that, well, there was a lot of talk of actually having like a US CBAM as well, and that would have evened out maybe the trade playing field, but would also have been a big step forward for climate change mitigation work. I think that's likely to take just a lot longer than it was expected when we first heard it discussed. some sectors are going to be much more heavily impacted than others, and some countries are going to be much more heavily impacted than others. We talked a little bit about that with steel and China and Russia. I think that one thing we didn't really mention that we should in this summary is that there are going to be a lot of smaller countries, I think, that are casualties. Small producers of fertilizer, small producers of aluminum, everyone around the edges who's sort of caught in the crossfire, I think, from a trade perspective, will probably lose out. Again, the impact that we're expecting is a few billion, but a few billion could be very little for some economies, and a few hundred million could be a lot for some others. From a adoption and reaction perspective, I think that China's game here is really interesting to watch, and how they roll out their own ETS scheme and develop it and make it robust, and what they do to then finance and fuel technologies that will be linchpins for the green economy. And then I think from an implementation in Europe standpoint, there are going to be these two challenges for Europe to solve. One is, can we get this whole cottage industry of verification, audit, data management, etc., to be a little more seamless, a little more fluid, a little more robust than it was with CSRD? And the second is, can we actually make sure that the money raised and the incentives created catalyze the development of disruptive innovation rather than just iteration around the edges, given that otherwise the history of bringing disruptive innovation to scale favors geographies right now other than Europe, as far as I can see. That's it for this episode, and if you liked it, feel free to check out our back catalog. You might find something else there that you like. And as always, we appreciate a follow. If you want to stay in touch, keep abreast of the latest episode, that is the best way, and also helps our podcast performance. So hit follow, share with a friend, all these things, very much appreciated.